Nobody understood why Olivia Bennet, the most powerful woman in the room, the CEO who made venture capitalists straighten their ties and clear their throats before speaking, walked straight past every single person who had spent the last hour trying to catch her eye, and stopped in front of the one man who had not. Marcus Johnson was standing near the tall windows at the far edge of the ballroom, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, his dark jacket pressed and clean, but nothing about him announcing itself. He was not trying to be noticed. He was simply there, watching the chandeliers refract light across the ceiling the way an architect notices things, patterns, geometry, the way beauty and structure hold each other up. The event itself was a masterpiece of deliberate excess. Rented peonies tumbling from centerpieces taller than a grown man, a string quartet positioned near the entrance for ambiance, waitstaff moving through the crowd, with the practiced invisibility of people paid to be present without being seen. Marcus had taken it all in, with a quiet, measuring attention that had nothing to do with judgment. He simply found the room more interesting as a problem of light and proportion than as a social arena. And then Olivia was in front of him, and the evening changed completely. Nobody saw it coming. That was what made it unforgettable. Not the dress she wore, not the waltz the band had just begun to play, not even the moment itself, but the fact that of every man in that gilded ballroom, the one she chose had not said a word to her all evening. He had not sent over a drink, had not positioned himself near her table, had not engineered a casual introduction through a mutual contact. He had simply stood near the window, peaceful and apart, like a man who had decided long ago that he did not need anything from this world, that he had not already earned with his own two hands. Several men had spent the evening doing exactly the opposite, moving closer to Olivia's orbit with the careful, practiced choreography of people who understood that proximity to power was itself a form of currency. They had offered clever observations, referenced mutual connections, laughed with generous precision at things that were almost funny. Olivia had smiled at all of them with the same measured warmth she brought to quarterly earnings calls, and moved on, and done it so gracefully that none of them could have said with confidence exactly when she had left the conversation. "May I have this dance?" 3 words. That was all. And Marcus Johnson, who had driven 40 minutes to attend a wedding he almost skipped, who had stood alone for nearly an hour, because he genuinely did not know how to perform the version of himself that parties seemed to require, looked at Olivia Bennet and felt the full weight of her question. She was not asking casually. Her dark eyes were steady, almost serious, as if she already knew something about him that he had not yet shared with anyone in that room. He almost said no. The refusal formed at the back of his throat, polite and practiced, the kind he had used 100 times at 100 events. But something in her expression stopped him. Not beauty, though she was striking, precise and composed, in a way that suggested she had always known exactly where she was going. It was something quieter, a quality beneath the confidence. Something that looked, if he was honest with himself, a little like loneliness wearing very expensive clothes. He set down his glass. "All right," he said, and whatever the evening had been before that moment, it stopped being that. No room in that ballroom would ever be the same again. Not for the guests who stood with champagne flutes halfway to their lips, watching 2 strangers move onto the parquet floor as the band played the opening bars of a Viennese waltz. Not for the women who had spent months angling for Olivia's attention at charity events and industry dinners. Not for the businessmen who had assumed, without pausing to question the assumption, that a black man standing quietly at the edge of a celebration was simply someone who belonged to the catering staff and had wandered in from the wrong door. And certainly not for Marcus or Olivia themselves, who stepped into that circle of light and discovered, within the first 8 counts of music, that the space between them had the rare quality of something already familiar. There is a particular kind of surprise the body holds when something it did not expect turns out to feel like something it already knew, like a word in a language you thought you had forgotten, surfacing whole and certain. Both of them felt it. Neither said anything. The music rose around them, and they simply began. The wedding itself, the bride radiant, the groom emotional, the cake 4 tiers of white fondant and seasonal flowers, receded to the periphery of everyone's attention and stayed there. Marcus could dance. That was the thing nobody in that room expected, and its impact was enormous. The kind of shock that arrives not as a single blow, but as a slow rearrangement of what you thought you understood. Not the polished, practiced movement of a man who had taken lessons to impress someone, but something deeper and older. A physical fluency that came from somewhere genuine, from years of Sunday afternoons in his grandmother's kitchen in Louisiana, when she played records, and taught him that music was a language the body could speak without embarrassment, and that the best dancers were not the ones who thought about the steps, but the ones who learned to listen. He led without forcing. He listened to the rhythm through the floor, through his partner, adjusting without thinking, responding to her shifts of weight with the instinctive precision of someone who had always understood that good partnering was less about leading and more about being present enough to catch whatever came. And Olivia, who had spent so many years in control, so many years deciding every outcome before it could surprise her, so many years wearing the particular armor that brilliant and wounded women learn to construct for themselves, followed. Genuinely followed. Not because she had no choice, but because for the first time in a very long time, following felt like exactly the right thing to do. The laughter and small talk around the edges of the room fell quiet. Cameras came out of pockets and evening bags. The couple who was supposed to be the center of the evening, the bride and groom, glowing and newlywed at the head table, watched with everyone else, and the bride leaned to her new husband and said something he couldn't quite hear over the music, but understood from her expression. The floor felt like it had rearranged itself around those two people, and the music seemed to understand what was happening, building slowly, the strings sweeping wider, the tempo finding its perfect breath. The conductor reading the room and giving the song a few extra measures at its crescendo, because he was a man who had played at 200 weddings and knew a real moment when he was inside one. Marcus turned to Olivia once, then again, his movements unhurried and certain, and her expression shifted in a way that the people closest to the floor would later struggle to describe. It was not simply pleasure. It was something closer to recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this. For someone who would not flinch, or perform, or push, but simply be present and sure and steady. When the music slowed toward its final phrase, neither of them spoke. The last note dissolved into the air, and the applause began, soft at first and then full, rolling through the ballroom like something genuine and unpracticed. Olivia did not release his hand. She stood inside that held moment, and then she turned her face slightly toward the room, toward every guest, every watching eye, every person who had spent the evening calculating worth and positioning themselves accordingly, and she said it clearly enough that the silence caught every syllable. Everyone here just watched you choose me. The room did not know what to do with that. Marcus felt something rise in the back of his neck. He looked at her carefully, wondering if she was teasing him or testing him or doing something he did not yet have a name for. He said quietly, "I only accepted your invitation." Olivia smiled, not the controlled boardroom smile that her staff had catalogued and quietly feared, but something rarer, uncalculated, almost young. "Exactly," she said, and the party around them slowly, inexplicably, came back to life, noisier than before, as if the room needed to release something that had been building in the watching. What Olivia had not told him, what she had not told anyone, because telling it would have required explaining a version of herself she rarely revisited, was that she already knew who Marcus Johnson was. She had known for 4 years. It had begun at an architectural design symposium in the spring, in a conference center on the 41st floor of a building downtown, at an event that drew developers and planners and engineers and the kind of serious, purposeful people who believe that the built world reflects the moral choices of the people who build it. Olivia had been 34. She had already run her company for 2 years. She was already powerful enough that people deferred to her in meetings and flinched slightly when she disagreed. But at the symposium, she had been new to the room, and rooms like that, one full of men who built physical things and had strong opinions about who belonged among them, had not been quick to make space for her. She had presented early in the afternoon, a brief talk on sustainable development frameworks in urban residential projects. The content was sharp, the delivery confident. She had spent 2 weeks on the slides. She had rehearsed until the words no longer felt like words, but like something she actually believed, which was easier because she actually did believe all of it. But afterward, during the networking portion, the conversations she tried to join closed like water around a lifted hand. Men spoke over her, responded to the men beside her instead of to her. Redirected questions she raised back to people across the room who had not raised them. It was not dramatic. It was the ordinary, insidious physics of being unseen in a space where you expected to be seen. And it was exhausting, in the particular way that ordinary things are exhausting, because there is no single moment you can point to. No single offense large enough to name, just the slow accumulation of small dismissals that adds up, by the end of an afternoon, to something very heavy. She had developed, over the years, a reliable way of dealing with these afternoons. She would find a quiet corner, check her messages, let the professionals around her perform their networking, while she recovered the part of herself that they had spent an hour eroding, and then she would leave as gracefully as possible and go back to an office where she was understood. She was in the middle of exactly this process, standing at the coffee station, phone in hand, face arranged into the expression of someone who is busy rather than lonely, when everything changed. By 3 in the afternoon, she had stopped trying to join conversations and was simply standing at the edge of the coffee station, checking her phone with an expression she had perfected over years of similar afternoons. And then a man she had never met crouched beside the table next to her and picked up the lanyard she had dropped without noticing and handed it back and said, while still looking at her name tag with genuine attention, rather than the automatic social scan of someone calculating whether she was worth his time, "Your talk was the strongest thing in the program today. That point you made about zoning variance, as a structural tool, I've been thinking about it for the last hour. Would you be willing to walk me through it?" He held out his hand. "Marcus Johnson. I do residential and mixed-use work, mostly in the South End." He had not looked around to see who was watching. He had not calculated whether the conversation would benefit him. He had simply meant what he said, and said it, with the uncomplicated directness of a man who had never learned to make smallness out of sincerity. She had talked to him for 45 minutes. It was one of the best professional conversations she'd had in years. He asked real questions. He pushed back intelligently and with good humor on 2 of her central assumptions, and was right both times. And he accepted her counterpoints without deflating or doubling down on pride. When the afternoon session was called back to order, she looked for him, but the room had reshuffled, and he was gone, and she had not thought to get his card, and she had never seen him again, until a wedding 4 years later, on a Thursday evening in April, when she walked into a ballroom and found him standing near the windows, like a man with nothing to prove to anyone. She recognized him immediately. The posture, the quiet, the specific way he looked at the ceiling, with an architect's particular attention, measuring, admiring, already understanding the structure beneath the decoration. Her heart did something unexpected, something she had not experienced in a long time, something that felt inconveniently real and refused to be categorized into something more manageable. She stood at the entrance to the ballroom for a moment longer than she needed to, watching him without him knowing it, and she thought, 4 years. 4 years of a life fully lived and fully controlled. 4 years of building something she was proud of. 4 years of learning not to need the thing she was suddenly aware of wanting very badly. She had spent 4 years building walls she was genuinely proud of, clean and high and impenetrable and necessary. The walls of a woman who had decided that she would not be hurt in that particular way again. And in the space of 10 seconds, all she could think was, that is him. The one who spoke to her when no one else would. The one who asked about her work as if it mattered more than anything else in the room. The one who had handed her a lanyard in a conference center on the 41st floor of a building in a city she barely knew and talked to her for 45 minutes as if she were the most interesting person he had encountered in years, and then disappeared before she thought to ask his name. She crossed the floor without deciding to. She simply moved, the way you move towards something your body recognized before your mind caught up. She stopped in front of him. She asked him to dance. And she had meant every single word she said afterward, even the ones that surprised her on the way out of her mouth, especially those. The days after the wedding carried a strange quality, like the air after summer lightning, charged and expectant and slightly unreal. Marcus drove home that Thursday night in a state of careful attention, replaying the evening the way you replay a piece of music you have heard only once, but already know you will not forget. He was not a man who fell easily into things. He had learned that lesson at a cost that had taken years to stop hurting, and he had rebuilt himself on the far side of grief with a steadiness that served him well in almost every part of his life, except, perhaps, the part that required him to want something for himself without immediately finding a reason to step back from it. His wife, Claire, had been gone for 6 years. Leukemia, diagnosed in the winter of her 31st year, a sentence handed down by a universe that gave no explanation and accepted no argument. They had been married for 4 years when she died. 4 years that Marcus kept in a part of himself the way you keep something precious, not locked away, not hidden, but placed somewhere careful and clean where nothing could damage it. He had photographs of Claire on the bookshelf in his apartment, and he looked at them sometimes in the morning with a quiet gratitude that had slowly, over the years, replaced the sharp grief of early loss. He did not think of remembering her as something sad anymore. He thought of it as something he did the way a man tends a garden, not because the flowers are dying, but because they deserve to be looked after. He had not dated anyone seriously since. He had not been looking. Or rather, he had told himself he was not looking, which is the thing people say when they are afraid that looking will mean they have moved on. And moving on will mean that the person they loved has somehow been diminished by the distance. He was 39 years old. He had a good practice, a small firm that did work he was proud of, an apartment with bookshelves on 2 full walls, and a habit of cooking elaborate Sunday meals that he shared with nobody. He was, by most reasonable measures, fine. But fine is not the same thing as full, and some part of him understood that distinction, even when he preferred not to examine it too closely. Olivia called him on a Monday. He had not expected that. He had assumed the way people assume after an evening that feels too bright and strange to sustain itself, that the wedding would fold back into ordinary life, and that would be the end of it. Instead, his phone rang, and her name appeared on the screen, and he sat very still for 1 full ring before answering. "I wondered," she said, without preamble, "whether you'd like to have dinner. Not somewhere impressive, just somewhere with good food and enough noise to justify talking at normal volume." There was a trace of humor in it, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He found himself smiling. "I know a place," he said. The restaurant was a small Creole place on the east side of the city. 12 tables, no dress code, a menu on a chalkboard that changed weekly, and a cook named Delphine, who had been running the same kitchen for 22 years and knew more about flavor than most people 3 times her age. Marcus was a regular. Delphine gave them the corner booth without being asked, and brought 2 glasses of iced tea before they'd looked at the board, and gave Marcus a look that said many things without saying any of them. Olivia looked around at the mismatched chairs and the framed photographs on the walls and the string lights someone had hung crookedly above the counter, and she said, "I like this." Not politely, genuinely. And Marcus, who had spent a year eating elaborate Sunday dinners alone, felt something in him that had been held very carefully begin to loosen, just slightly, the way a knot loosens when the tension on one end is finally released. They ordered without looking at their phones. They talked the way 2 people talk when they are both intelligent enough to know that the best conversations are the ones neither person is steering toward a predetermined destination. The food arrived, disappeared, was replaced by coffee, and still neither of them checked the time. Outside the window, the street settled into its late evening quiet, and inside the restaurant, Delphine wiped down the counter and pretended she was not listening, and listened anyway. They talked for 3 hours, not about business, or at least not only about business, about architecture, and what it means to build things that outlast you, about the particular loneliness of leadership, and whether it is a feature or a bug, about the music of the 1960s, and the way cities change, and whether change is always the same as progress. Marcus told her about Claire. Eventually, not because the conversation required it, but because Olivia asked a question about what had brought him to his particular city, and the honest answer involved a hospital and a decision to stay because leaving felt like abandonment. He told it plainly, without performing sorrow or protecting her from the weight of it. He simply told the truth, the way he had learned to do after years of understanding that the truth, even when it is heavy, is the only foundation that holds. Olivia was quiet for a long moment afterward. Then she said, "I had a relationship for 6 years. He was brilliant and funny, and I thought I understood what we were building together. And then I found out in the most ordinary possible way, the worst kind, that he had been lying to me for most of those 6 years. Not small lies, the kind that reshape everything you thought was real." She looked at her glass. "I didn't fall apart. I'm not sure that was a good thing. I think I just rearranged, became more careful, more precise, kept everything very controlled. People call me the Ice Queen. I've heard it. I don't mind it usually. But sometimes I think what I'm actually doing is not letting anything touch me anymore. And I'm not sure that's the same as being strong." Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, simply, "I think knowing the difference between those two things is already most of the work." Olivia looked at him. For a moment her expression was entirely unguarded, and in that unguarded moment, Marcus saw something he recognized from a long time ago, the look of a person who has been carrying something alone for so long that being offered a hand is almost disorienting. The gossip began, as gossip always does, before anyone had any actual facts to work with. Someone from the wedding had shared photographs, not of the dance itself, but of the moment just after, when Olivia had said what she said, and Marcus had answered, and the light above them had caught both their faces at exactly the right angle to make the image look like something from a film. The comments and conversations that grew from those images took on a life entirely disconnected from the two people at their center. By the following week, it had reached the kind of people whose business it was not to know the particular subspecies of powerful person who treats other people's private lives as a resource to be managed or exploited, depending on which serves them better in a given moment. Within Olivia's company, a senior director named Raymond Holt, who had wanted the partnership on 2 major development projects that Olivia had quietly awarded to an outside firm, saw an opportunity in the noise. He was not a villain in the operatic sense. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more dangerous. A man of average intelligence who had decided that the best way to make himself larger was to make the people around him smaller. He understood, with the instinct that such men develop over years of practice, that the most effective weapon is not a lie told loudly, but a suspicion, planted gently, watered with concern, left to grow in the dark. He began, casually and systematically, to plant a version of events in every conversation that would serve him. Marcus Johnson, in Raymond's telling, was an ambitious man who had identified a wealthy woman and executed a very calculated approach. The dancing had been a performance. The apparent disinterest had been strategy. Everything quiet and genuine about Marcus was, in Raymond's version, simply a more sophisticated kind of manipulation. It spread the way these things do not as accusation but as concern, the most effective form of cruelty, because it wears the face of care. People said they were worried about Olivia. People said they hoped she was being careful. People who had never had a real conversation with Marcus Johnson offered confident opinions about his character based on absolutely nothing except the story that Raymond had seeded and other people's willingness to tend it. The pressure reached Olivia through her board in the subtle ways that powerful organizations communicate disapproval. A meeting that ran long on the wrong agenda item. A question raised with elaborate casualness about whether personal relationships might create liability exposure. It was theater, but theater performed by people who held real votes, and it had real consequences. Marcus heard it differently, through a colleague, who told him directly, and without softening, because she was the kind of friend who believed in clean information over comfortable silence. He sat with it for an evening. He poured a glass of water and sat at his kitchen table and did not turn on any lights as the evening came in through the window. He thought about it the way he thought about structural problems in his work, not with heat, but with the patient. Systematic attention of someone who knows that the right response to a failing wall is not to push harder against it, but to understand what is actually happening in the foundation. He thought about all the versions of this situation available to him. He could stay. He could fight it publicly, let the facts speak, refuse to be pushed out by a story that had no truth in it. He could call Raymond Holt and say exactly what he knew to be true about the man's motives. All of these things were available to him, and all of them were, in their own way, satisfying to imagine. And then he thought about Olivia, sitting in her office on the 43rd floor, fielding pressure from people she depended on professionally, defending someone she had known for a handful of months against people she had worked alongside for years. He thought about what it would cost her to keep fighting for him, and he thought about whether a man of genuine character asks a person to keep paying that price on his behalf. He made the decision that he had always known he would make in a situation like this. The decision that cost him something he valued, in order to protect someone who mattered more than his own pride. He called Olivia and told her he was stepping back from the collaboration project. He gave professional reasons, scheduling conflicts, bandwidth issues, and they both knew exactly what he was actually saying, and they both let the real meaning sit between them, because neither of them was ready to say it plainly yet. After the call, he sat in his kitchen for a long time, in the particular silence of a man who has done the right thing and is not especially happy about it. He stared at the pot on the stove, the elaborate Sunday meal he had made out of habit, sitting untouched, and he thought about loneliness and dignity and the specific arithmetic of choosing other people's safety over your own. Olivia put down her phone and stayed very still for close to an hour. Then, because she had learned a long time ago that stillness without direction is just avoidance wearing a different mask, she started making calls. The thing about truth is that it does not usually arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives piece by piece, in the small, accumulated weight of documentation and testimony, and the patient work of people who refuse to let a lie settle into the shape of fact. Olivia had always known this. It was one of the first things she had learned in business, that the difference between a truth and a rumor was almost never the facts themselves, but the willingness of someone to do the slower, less exciting work of establishing them. She had spent 2 days making calls. She had spoken to people who knew Marcus professionally, to clients he had served, to city planners who had worked alongside him on projects, to the colleague who had introduced him to the development community in the South End 15 years ago. What she heard, in every conversation, was the same story told in different voices. A man who did excellent work and asked for nothing he had not earned, and had a quiet, consistent habit of walking away from things that would compromise what he believed. A professor named Dr. Gilbert Crane, who had taught urban planning for 30 years and supervised Marcus's graduate thesis, received a call and returned it promptly. What he said was not dramatic, but it was thorough and sourced and unambiguous. 3 years before, a community development group in the East Quadrant had proposed a large-scale housing project that would have displaced nearly 300 low-income families. A private firm had approached Marcus with a proposal, his design innovation, a structural methodology he had been developing for 6 years, which could have been acquired for a sum that would have changed his financial life permanently. The firm intended to use it for the displacement project. Marcus had reviewed the proposal, understood exactly what it would fund, and declined, not with a negotiation, not with a counteroffer. He simply said no, wrote a letter explaining why, and went back to his work. He had also, at around the same time, quietly submitted a redesign proposal to the City Planning Board that modified the project's footprint to preserve the majority of the existing community. The proposal was largely adopted. Most people had never known who submitted it. That was, apparently, how Marcus preferred to operate, not seeking recognition, not calculating the political advantage of a visible act of conscience, simply doing what he believed was right and returning to his drafting table without ceremony. Dr. Crane presented this to the board in his precise and unperturbed academic cadence, supported by 3 sets of documentation organized in a folder he had clearly prepared before arriving. Raymond Holt sat through the presentation and said very little. Afterward, when Olivia looked at him across the conference table, his face had the particular quality of someone who has played a hand badly and is now calculating whether to fold or try something else. He folded. The corrections that followed were formal and quiet. The atmosphere in the room shifted in a way everyone felt, and nobody overstated. Afterward, Olivia sat alone in her office, looking out at the city from the 43rd floor, thinking about walls and what they actually protect versus what they only appear to protect. She thought about Marcus in his kitchen, probably cooking something complicated and eating it alone because he had decided the noise was not worth it. She thought about his voice when he told her about Claire, even and unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned that grief survives being spoken about, and that love survives grief, and neither diminishes the other. She thought about what it meant that a man like that, who had chosen principle over profit and dignity over convenience and quiet over acclaim, in every decision that had mattered, had also chosen to step away from something he wanted in order to protect someone else from the weight of wanting it. She thought about what that said about him. She thought about what her silence said about her. Then she got her coat and left the building. She found Marcus at his office, a clean, bright space on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse, full of architectural models and natural light, and the kind of organized precision that reflects a particular quality of mind, the quality of someone who has learned to make peace with complexity by arranging the parts of it that can be arranged, and sitting honestly with the parts that cannot. He was at his drafting table when she arrived, bent over a set of drawings with his sleeves rolled up and a pencil held loosely between 2 fingers. And he looked up when she knocked on the open door, and his expression held briefly. The particular combination of relief and wariness that belongs to someone who has been hoping for something he has been trying not to hope for. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't," he said. "I do. I let other people's noise become my reason to be quiet when I should have been louder." She stepped into the room. The afternoon light came through the high warehouse windows at a long, warm angle. "I know what Dr. Crane told the board. I know what you chose not to do and why. But I also want to say I would have believed you anyway, before any of that. I just got scared, and I let the fear talk me out of trusting what I already knew." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He set down his pencil. "I walked away without telling you why, without giving you the chance to make your own decision. I was trying to protect you, and I ended up making you feel like something else entirely." He paused. "That was also an apology, in case it wasn't clear." Something eased in the room. The particular tension of 2 people who have been holding carefully onto separate versions of the same hurt, both slowly, simultaneously, setting them down. Then Olivia said, in a voice that was steadier than she expected, "This time, do you still want to choose me?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The models on his shelves caught the afternoon light and threw long architectural shadows across the floor between them. Small cities of intention, each one a problem solved with care, each one a version of the question he had spent his whole career asking, what does it mean to build something that will hold? He thought about all the careful walls he had built over 6 years, not out of fear, but out of grief, out of the genuine and necessary work of surviving something enormous. He thought about how walls serve their purpose, and how a building that is only walls and no windows is not a home but a prison, and how he had known that, intellectually, for a long time, and had chosen to live inside the prison anyway, because at least it was his. He thought about Claire, and what she would have said to him right now, and he knew exactly what she would have said, because she had been, in life, the most direct person he had ever loved, and she would have looked at him with that particular expression of fond exasperation, and said, "Marcus, for a man who builds things for a living, you are being remarkably slow about this." He felt something almost like laughter, and then something deeper and quieter beneath it, the particular feeling of permission, not permission from her, permission from himself. He thought about a Thursday evening in April, and the particular feeling of music that finds the right tempo and a partner who knows how to listen. "The first time," he said, "you chose me." He stood up from the drafting table and crossed the room. "This time, it's my turn." He took her hand, and it was nothing like a ballroom and everything like a waltz. The year that followed moved the way good years do not in dramatic arcs, but in the steady accumulation of small, genuine things. Marcus completed his work on 2 of the most consequential mixed-use residential projects the city had seen in a decade. The work was his, shaped by a philosophy that had always been his structure in service of community, beauty that does not ask people to be smaller than they are to deserve it. He thought often, during those months of drawing and reworking, and standing on job sites in the early morning cold, about the housing community he had protected years before the families still living in the homes that existed, because he had said no, when saying yes would have made him rich. He understood now, more fully than he had at the time, that that decision had been a kind of rehearsal for who he wanted to be. Every choice that followed had been shaped by it, including the choice to step back from something he wanted rather than let it cost someone else. The recognition came, as it always does when it means something, from the work itself. A regional design award, a feature in a well-regarded architectural journal, an inquiry from a national firm that he politely declined because he was not interested in being absorbed into something larger. He was interested in building something that would last, something with his name on it in the truest sense, not as a brand, but as a commitment. Olivia's company had its strongest fiscal year on record. She remained the most demanding person in any room she entered, and her staff remained the most loyal in the industry, because she had always understood that those two things are not opposites but partners. She still had mornings that required 10 deep breaths before the first meeting. She still had moments when the old walls felt like the only sensible option. But she had also developed, over that year, the habit of calling Marcus on the drive home, and somehow those conversations about nothing particular, about the mundane and the structural and the funny, small absurdities of a life being lived alongside another person, had become the most important part of her day. She had told him once, sitting in her car in the parking garage of her building, because she had not wanted to go inside until the call was finished. I don't think I knew what it felt like to genuinely look forward to something until this. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, I know exactly what you mean. And they had both sat with that for a while, in the particular companionable silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill every space with words. The charity gala was held in February, a fundraiser for the community arts program that both of them had quietly co-sponsored through their respective organizations. The ballroom was not the same one as the wedding. This room was softer in its lines, the lighting warmer, the guest list a mixture of genuine friends and people of good purpose, rather than the competitive, circling energy of a business event where everyone is simultaneously on display and doing the displaying. There were children's drawings framed on the walls, contributed by the program's students, crooked houses, and enormous suns and figures, holding hands, and Marcus had stopped to look at them when he arrived, and he had thought about what it meant to teach a child that making something was worth the effort, that the act of creation was its own kind of argument against the world's indifference. He had thought about the buildings he designed, how the best ones started not as blueprints, but as exactly this kind of impulse, the deep, inarticulate human need to shape the space you inhabit into something that reflects who you are or who you hope to be. The band was a 7-piece ensemble that had clearly spent the afternoon working through their set with care, and when the evening reached its midpoint and the leader nodded to his strings, the opening phrase of a Viennese waltz filled the room exactly as it had nearly a year before, in a different city, on a different night that had turned out to be the same night. Olivia heard it and felt something move in her chest, not nostalgia exactly, but the recognition of a thread connecting past and present, the kind of continuity that only becomes visible when enough time has passed to see the shape of it. She had spent 4 years not knowing where Marcus Johnson was, and then a year of knowing exactly where he was, and the distance between those two versions of her life felt immeasurable in a way she would not have predicted. She looked across the room and found him already looking at her, the way he always found her in crowded rooms, not searching, not scanning, just knowing, with the quiet certainty of a man who has learned the difference between looking and seeing. He crossed to where she stood, and there was no hesitation in either of them now, no performance and no calculation, just two people who had learned something essential about each other and had chosen, with full knowledge and clear eyes, to keep on learning, for as long as the learning would go. He extended his hand. She took it. They stepped onto the floor, and the room shifted around them, the way rooms do when something true is happening at their center. Not silently, not dramatically, but with the particular quality of attention that people pay when they recognize something real and are glad to be near it. The music gathered itself, and they moved together with the fluency of people who have had a year of practice in the more important kind of listening, the kind that happens in kitchens at 10 at night, and on phone calls on the highway, and in the small, reliable exchanges of two people building something that neither of them could have built alone. The waltz is an old form. It has been danced at celebrations and coronations and ordinary Saturday evenings in living rooms for 200 years, and the reason it survives is not that it is complicated, but that it is honest. It requires two people to be in genuine contact, to feel each other's weight and intention and breath, to move as a single thing, without either person disappearing. Marcus understood this about it. Olivia was beginning to. No one laughed. No one whispered behind a cupped hand. The room watched with open and uncomplicated warmth, and when the music reached its final phrase and Marcus turned Olivia once more and brought her gently back, the applause that followed was not the complicated, uncertain kind of the wedding, it was the honest kind, full-throated and warm, the sound of people recognizing something they could not entirely name, but were glad to have witnessed and glad to be part of. Olivia leaned close enough to be heard only by him. "I remember what I said the first time," she said, "that everyone saw you choose me." Marcus smiled, not the wide, unguarded smile of someone with nothing at stake, but the deep, earned smile of a man who has lost things and rebuilt himself and found, on the far side of all of it, something he had not expected to find and is not taking for granted. "That night you chose me," he said. "You walked across that room, and you chose me in front of everyone, and I was too surprised to understand what that meant." He held her gaze in the warm lamplight. "But what I never told you from the very first note of that song, from the moment you said, 'Trust me,' and I believed you, my heart had already decided. Long before anyone in that room was watching." She looked at him for a moment in that still, full way that had become one of his favorite things about her, the way she held an important thing before she answered it, as if she understood that good things deserve the small ceremony of being received carefully. Then she laughed, the real laugh, the one his cooking drew out of her, the one that had started appearing somewhere around their third dinner at Delphine's and had never quite stopped. "You realize," she said, "that is objectively the most romantic thing you have said in 12 months. I've been saving it," he said. And she laughed again, and the sound of it rose into the warm air of the room, unguarded and full, and it was more beautiful than any waltz. The band transitioned to something slower and warmer, and the other couples drifted back onto the floor, and Marcus and Olivia stayed where they were, neither hurrying toward what came next and neither afraid of it. Olivia thought about the woman she had been at 34, standing alone at a coffee station in a conference room, full of people who had decided, without looking at her carefully, that she did not belong. She thought about how much of the last decade she had spent proving to rooms full of people that they had been wrong about her, and how exhausting that project had been, and how different it felt to simply stand beside someone who had never needed to be convinced. Marcus thought about Sunday mornings in his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of chicory coffee and cast iron, and the particular quality of Louisiana light through old windows, and his grandmother saying, "Boy, you are going to be somebody's perfect thing someday, and you better not be in too much of a hurry to find out whose." He had been in his 30s before he understood that she was not talking about romantic destiny. She was talking about readiness, about becoming the person capable of receiving what life had for you before it arrived. He thought he might finally understand what she meant. Outside the tall windows, the city moved through its ordinary February evening traffic signals, cycling, streetlights coming on in the blue dusk, buildings standing in their patient geometry, holding up the sky the way buildings have always done, the way good things do when they are built on honest ground. Inside, two people who had learned the hard way that trust is not a feeling but a practice, and that love is not a destination but a direction, held each other in the warmth of a room full of good people and let the music carry them forward into whatever came next. Some things do not need to be said to be true. Some things are simply made real by the choosing, and the choosing, and the choosing again every day, in the quiet, ongoing architecture of a life built well and a love built honestly, one careful, deliberate decision at a time. In a year, there would be other evenings and other decisions, and the ordinary frictions of two real people navigating a real world that does not pause for anyone's happiness. But there would also be this, a foundation laid with open eyes and chosen hands by two people who had each, in their own way, been through the fire and come out the other side still capable of warmth. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.